All right, well, welcome back here after the timeout here. This next stretch is going to be hard-hitting. We're going to focus on how in some parts of the world throughout imperialism, there were definitive indigenous and local responses to the rising powers of imperialism. I'm going to take you through a series of 6 examples. Now, that's a lot to handle. It's a lot to digest, but I've kind of categorically broke them down, and I think there's some really good past shapes to future that goes beyond history to make this memorable, so you guys should enjoy this. Now, the first of the examples we've already actually talked about. In South Asia, the sepoys were used by the British East India Company to fight, to protect their holdings, and basically to enforce their policies over India, but eventually sepoys rebelled against the British East India Company, which led to the British government eventually taking over the colony and turning that into the British Raj. So there's one good example of resistance to imperialism. Another example I'm going to share has to do with America and United States history, but it fits into WHAP because the Native American resistance to United States imperialism here within the United States. And that's a kind of a tricky one because the United States wasn't conquering any foreign territories, but the conquest of the West here in the United States throughout the 1800s and the eradication of various native tribes such as the Cherokee with the Trail of Tears, but also in the Midwest and on the Great Plains of the United States, a tremendous war was fought for almost 50 years between the United States government and various native tribes, most predominantly the Sioux tribes. And the Sioux were a collection of native tribes that held territories throughout the Midwest, the upper Midwest, on the Great Plains region of the United States. And the Sioux fought a long-standing war throughout the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and 90s against the United States government. And the Sioux resistance is very similar to resistance movements that occurred in Africa, for example, where native tribes fought against Europeans. And the Sioux, who believed that their territory was, of course, their own homeland, compared to the United States government, which was trying to take that land and move natives onto reservations, the Sioux put up a staunch defense of their territories and forced the U.S. government into bloody conflict for over 30 years. And it wasn't just wars in which the Sioux fought the American government and other tribes like the Sioux. You also had a cultural war that was fought. And a great example of this was the Ghost Dance movement. The Ghost Dance movement swept across the Great Plains region of the United States in the 1880s and 1890s. And the Ghost Dance movement was significant because it was a cultural response to encroachment by Americans. Thousands of Sioux and other tribal peoples across the plains participated in widespread protest movements against the U.S. government through ritualistic song and dance. And the Sioux performed these ritualistic song and dance as part of their ancestral worship, which is an important polytheistic religion in native cultures around the world, including the United States. And the Sioux and other tribes participated in this ghost dance movement. The U.S. government saw this as an act of hostility. However, it really was very much a peaceful way to protest and to restore tribal identities that had been lost for hundreds of years due to white encroachment. But ultimately, the U.S. government clamped down hard on the Sioux and other tribes in the plains. And by the end of the 1890s, the United States had claimed victory in the Plains Wars, and this was a crushing defeat for natives. They were mostly forced onto reservations, but the ghost dance movement is a good AP World History term to use for resistance against imperialism. Now, speaking of song and dance, I'm going to make a reference here to the next resistor, and notice we're not really going in order here chronologically, but the next resistor was around in the late 1700s, and he fought wars against Spanish imperialism in South America. So we're rolling the clock back a bit, and this guy's name you should know perhaps if you're a fan of hip-hop, because the legendary rapper Tupac, who was a famous hip-hop artist in the 1990s, and then was killed in the 1990s at the peak of his career, Tupac's full name is Tupac Amaru Shakur. In world history, is actually incredibly significant to imperial resistance movements because the man who lived in the late 1700s in the modern-day country of Peru, which is in South America and a former Spanish colony, Tupac Amaru II was a great native indigenous resistor who fought against the Spanish throughout the late 1770s. Tupac Amaru II led a rebellion against the Spanish, which ultimately failed, by the way. They did not gain independence. That would come later with Simón Bolívar in the 1830s. But I put Tupac Amaru in this conversation because, number one, it does link the past to the future. That's where the great rapper Tupac came from. That's what his parents named him after, Tupac Amaru II, the Peruvian resistor against Spanish imperialism. And I know that this is a previous time period than where we're at, but I just thought that the connection to the modern day, or I shouldn't even say modern now, Tupac's almost 30 years in the past, but the culture, the pop culture reference in American history, I thought it was kind of a neat tie-in for you guys. But Tupac Amaru II was an important imperial resistor in South America. He was ultimately captured and executed, but we know that later on in the 1830s, all of South America became liberated from the Spanish under Simón Bolívar and other freedom fighters. Now, another pop culture tie into world history with modern-day American pop culture. If you were to ask most Americans today, one of the most famous American athletes of all time, they're going to undeniably say Muhammad Ali. But Muhammad Ali was not his original name. I've even said this earlier in the year. It was Cassius Clay. Muhammad Ali only chose the name Muhammad Ali after he had converted to Islam. And perhaps he was inspired by one of the great imperial resistors of all time, Muhammad Ali, who lived in the 1800s in Egypt. And Muhammad Ali was a different type of imperial resistor because Muhammad Ali fought against the Ottomans to liberate Egypt from Ottoman rule in the early 1800s. And he succeeded. Egypt, which eventually would fall under the British Empire, we talked about that with the Suez Canal. But Muhammad Ali is an important figure for you guys to be aware of. We're talking about Muhammad Ali, the liberator here, because he liberated Egyptians from the Ottoman Empire. And Muhammad Ali of the 1800s is considered to be a great fighter, much like the boxer in the 1960s and 70s. And he also is important because he's considered to be the founder of modern-day Egypt. And although Egypt kind of was under the influence and control of the British Empire throughout most of the 1800s, even after Muhammad Ali's success, still, the modern-day country of Egypt considers Muhammad Ali to be one of their great resistors. I want to now add two more, but one that is a name that should always stay with you, because if you look at all these resistance movements, they're led by men. We've been talking very much heavily on the male side of imperialism, but how about the female side? And for that, let's go down to Africa, where in the modern-day country of Ghana, which is along the west or Gold Coast of Africa, the west coast of Africa, a female leader came about as one of the great imperial resistors of the age of imperialism. Late 1800s, early 1900s, her name, Yaa Asantewaa, or Yaa Asantewaa, either of those pronunciations can work. Yaa Asantewaa or Yaa Asantewaa was a great imperial resistor against the British Empire in the late 1880s, late 1890s, early 1900s, so right at the tail end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. Yaa Asantewaa helped organize the Asante tribe, which was a group of modern-day Ghana, like a group of Africans living in modern-day Ghana. They had had their own sort of kingdom prior to imperialism, but the British took over that region of Africa. But Yaa Asantewaa and others rebelled against the British in what was known as the Golden Stool War. The Golden Stool War. And in the Golden Stool War, the name comes from the fact that the Asante peoples believed that the ruler would sit on like a golden stool or a throne. And in this war, Yaa Asantewaa and the Asante members were able to create their own independent country within West Africa. And they were able to maintain somewhat of independence from the British Empire, which is very rare considering how in Africa very few countries were able to resist. But along with Yaa Asantewaa in Ghana, another African example of resistance was in the modern-day countries of Ethiopia and Eritrea, where local tribes, which remember were Christian, that region of Africa was heavily Christian, But tribes in that region were able to band together, and they were able to resist the Italian imperial domination. The Italians had tried to take over modern-day Eritrea, modern-day Ethiopia, but much to the success of the African peoples living in those countries in the late 1800s, early 1900s, those countries did not fall under the control of the Italians. And so it was two shocking examples of how in both Ghana, modern-day Ghana, and modern-day Ethiopia, Ethiopian peoples were able to resist, and they formed what was known as the Abyssinia Empire. So you have the Ashanti Empire and the Abyssinia Empire, two examples of African empires that formed despite European powers having most of the control in Africa, and those are definitely outlier examples, two examples that are unique in African history. So the Asante and the Abyssinia empires were able to stave off foreign imperialism. But we have one more topic. That's two fingers. I meant to hold up one. One more topic, and that we are going to go back to China. We were on China last week, as well as Japan, and we know that China was losing territories significantly to Europeans and Japanese and Americans in the spheres of influence phase of Chinese history. And as the Qing dynasty was on its last legs, remember that dynasty fell apart in 1912, ultimately, the Chinese people would put up one last fight. Members of what were known as the Society of Harmonious Fists, like put them up right there. The members of the, sorry, I made myself laugh here on the ATW. Members of the Society of Harmonious Fists, aka the Boxers, would form a rebellion against modern European, American, and Japanese forces that were taking territories in China. These were known as the Boxers, and what became known as the Boxer Rebellion. So the last example here, the Boxer Rebellion, you want to relate that to China. The Boxers, for years in the late 1800s and early 1900s, attacked railroads, telegraph wires, harbors. They conducted what today would be considered terrorist activities, but in the end, the Boxers put up a very stiff armed resistance. And unfortunately for the Boxers, although the rebellion was met with a lot of acceptance in China, right? Lots of Chinese traditionalists, Confucianists would have been part of this Boxer Rebellion. The European, American, and Japanese military powers that were there to protect their spheres of influence ultimately crushed the Boxer Rebellion in the early 1900s. But that is a theme, unfortunately, a continuity throughout most of these independence fights. Very few of them succeed. So the Boxer Rebellion is a bit like Tupac Amaru II's rebellion in Peru. But even though they failed, that doesn't mean that they're not noteworthy. So we have here a list of very important rebellions and responses to imperialism to go along with the migration, and that's going to wrap it up here for the ATW today. Remember, there are questions that you should be filling out, and those are due on Sunday night, but we will be talking, and I'll be answering questions about these resistance movements Tuesday in office hours, and then Wednesday we have a live class where I'm going to be going over not just this material, but other material as it pertains to Africa. So you don't want to miss Wednesday's class this week. And then I'll also have a video for you guys, not one I produced, but a one on YouTube that you'll watch for Thursday. We have live class Friday. And so with that, WHAPers, stay safe, be healthy, stay fit. And as always, the past shapes the future. Have a great rest of your week, WHAPers.